No one played with the paralyzed son of the millionaire until a poor girl approached and challenged the boy to play in a simple way. When the millionaire saw the two connecting, he broke into tears, touched by the scene that was transforming his son's life. What the businessman decides to do will surprise you. Chapter 1. Shattered Wheels. The pristine wheels of the wheelchair gleamed under the autumn sun as 7-year-old Lucas Thornton sat motionless in Central Park, his small hands resting on the armrests. His eyes, once bright with childlike wonder, now followed the other children running around the playground with a distant longing that broke the heart of anyone who noticed. Not far from him, Maxwell Thornton, his father and one of New York's most influential tech moguls, was engaged in a heated phone conversation, pacing back and forth with his attention firmly fixed on the stock market rather than his son. "I don't care what the board thinks, Jeremy. The acquisition goes through today or heads will roll," Maxwell barked into his phone, completely oblivious to the quiet desperation in his son's eyes. Lucas had been paralyzed from the waist down for almost a year now. The accident, a memory that haunted Maxwell every night, had changed everything. Before, Lucas had been an energetic child who loved soccer and climbing trees. Now, he was confined to a wheelchair, his world limited by its wheels and his father's inability to face what had happened. The Thornton name was synonymous with success in New York City. Maxwell's tech company, Horizon Innovations, had revolutionized the healthcare industry with cutting-edge medical devices. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire helping others heal while failing miserably at healing his own family. "Mr. Thornton?" A young woman approached, her voice soft but professional. "I'm Samantha, Lucas's new physical therapist." Maxwell ended his call abruptly and turned to face her. "Yes, of course. We discussed this last week. I was wondering if you'd like to join us for Lucas's session today. It might be helpful for you to see the exercises we're working on so you can assist him at home." Maxwell's expression tightened. "I have meetings all afternoon. That's why." "We hired you, isn't it? To take care of these things so I can focus on my work." Samantha's professional smile never faltered, though disappointment flashed briefly in her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Thornton. We'll be done by 5. As she walked away toward Lucas, Maxwell felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. He knew he should be more involved, knew that Lucas needed him, but every time he looked at his son in that wheelchair, all he could see was his own failure as a father. The next day followed the same routine. Maxwell dropped Lucas off at the park with his nanny, promising to join them later but knowing he wouldn't. Lucas didn't even respond anymore. He had grown accustomed to his father's empty promises. It was Tuesday when everything began to change. Lucas was in his usual spot, watching the world go by, when a flash of fiery red hair caught his attention. A little girl, perhaps a year older than him, was running circles around an elderly woman who was calling after her. "Ember! Slow down, dear, these old legs can't keep up with you." The girl Ember laughed, a sound so full of joy it seemed to brighten the entire park. Then, as if feeling Lucas's gaze on her, she stopped and turned toward him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an invisible connection forming between them. Without hesitation, Ember ran over to Lucas, her red curls bouncing with each step. "Hi, I'm Ember Sullivan. What's your name?" Lucas, taken aback by her directness, mumbled, "Lucas, do you want to play I Spy with me?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. I can't really play games," Lucas responded, gesturing weakly to his wheelchair. Ember tilted her head, her green eyes sparkling with intelligence beyond her years. "Sure you can. I Spy is a looking game. You don't need to run or jump. You just need eyes and a brain, and you've got both." For the first time in months, a small smile tugged at Lucas's lips. "I'll go first," Ember declared, looking around. Dramatically, "I spy with my little eye, something blue." What started as a simple game soon turned into an hour of laughter and excitement. Lucas found himself engaged in the world around him again, seeing it through Ember's enthusiastic perspective. By the time Ember's guardian called her to leave, Lucas had smiled more times than he had in the entire past year. "Can we play again tomorrow?" Lucas asked, a hint of desperation in his voice. Ember grinned. "Of course. Mrs. Reynolds brings me here every Tuesday and Thursday. She takes care of me and 5 other kids, but she lets me come to the park because I have too much energy for the house." As Ember ran back to Mrs. Reynolds, Lucas watched her go with newfound hope. For the first time since the accident, he was looking forward to something. When Maxwell arrived to pick up Lucas that evening, he was surprised to find his son animated, telling his nanny about a red-haired girl named Ember and their game of I Spy. "She sounds nice," Maxwell commented absently, checking his emails on his phone. "She is, Dad. Can we come back to the park on Thursday? Please? She said she'll be here." The urgency in Lucas's voice made Maxwell look up from his phone. "I suppose we can arrange that," he said, surprised by his son's sudden enthusiasm. Over the next few weeks, Lucas and Ember's friendship blossomed. Every Tuesday and Thursday became sacred days for Lucas, who waited eagerly for his fiery-haired friend to appear in the park. Ember, with her boundless energy and creativity, always found ways to include Lucas in games that didn't require the use of his legs. One Thursday, Ember arrived with a homemade obstacle course designed specifically for Lucas's wheelchair. She had spent hours planning it with the help of Mrs. Reynolds, marking paths with chalk and setting up challenges that Lucas could navigate. "It's a hero's quest," Ember explained excitedly. "Oh, you're the knight, and you have to rescue the princess from the dragon." Lucas's face lit up as he navigated the course, with Ember running alongside him, cheering him on. From a distance, Maxwell, who had actually made time to come to the park, that day watched in astonishment. His son was laughing, truly laughing, for the first time since the accident. "He seems different with her," Maxwell commented to the nanny. "She's good for him," the nanny replied simply. "She sees him, not his wheelchair." That night, Maxwell found himself standing in the doorway of Lucas's bedroom, watching his son sleep peacefully, a small smile still on his face. Something had shifted, and Maxwell felt a strange mixture of gratitude and jealousy. A little girl had managed to connect with Lucas in ways he couldn't, or perhaps hadn't tried to. The next day, Maxwell made an unprecedented decision. He cancelled his afternoon meetings. "Lucas," he said over breakfast, "how would you feel about inviting Ember and Mrs. Reynolds for dinner sometime?" Lucas's fork clattered onto his plate. "Really, Dad? You mean it?" Maxwell nodded, surprised by his son's reaction and his own desire to meet the girl who had brought light back into Lucas's life. "Yes, I think it's time I met your friend," Maxwell said, realizing how disconnected he had become from his son's world. "And maybe we can thank Mrs. Reynolds for bringing her to the park." What Maxwell didn't know was that this simple dinner invitation would set in motion a series of events that would change all their lives forever. The red-haired girl with the infectious laugh wasn't just any child, and her story, intertwined with loss, resilience, and an uncanny ability to heal broken hearts, would soon become inextricably linked with the Thorntons' own journey toward healing. Chapter 2. A Flame of Hope. The Thornton mansion stood imposingly against the Manhattan skyline, its modern glass facade reflecting the setting sun. Inside, the usually quiet halls were filled with an unfamiliar sound, Lucas's excited voice, as he directed the household staff on exactly how to prepare for their special guests. "Dad, do you think Ember will like the chocolate fountain? And should we have the chef make kid food or fancy food?" Lucas asked, wheeling himself around the expansive dining room with newfound energy. Maxwell, who had actually come home early to oversee the preparations, smiled at his son's enthusiasm. "Why don't we have both? And yes, I think any child would be impressed by a chocolate fountain." When the doorbell rang, Lucas's face lit up. "They're here." Maxwell watched as his son wheeled himself toward the entrance hall faster than he'd ever seen him move. Following behind, Maxwell was struck by the realization that he couldn't remember the last time Lucas had been this excited about anything. The massive oak door swung open to reveal a stark contrast to the opulence of the Thornton mansion. Standing on the doorstep was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a well-worn cardigan. Beside her stood Ember, her wild red curls barely contained by a headband, wearing a dress that had clearly seen better days but was clean and pressed for the occasion. "Welcome to our home," Maxwell said, extending his hand to Mrs. Reynolds. "I'm Maxwell Thornton. Thank you for accepting our invitation." Mrs. Reynolds shook his hand firmly, her weathered face kind but assessing. "Martha Reynolds, thank you for having us. Ember hasn't stopped talking about this dinner since you invited." "Hers?" Ember, meanwhile, had already bypassed the adults and was crouching beside Lucas's wheelchair. "Your house is like a castle," she exclaimed, her green eyes wide with wonder. Lucas beamed. "Want me to show you around? I can go really fast in the hallways when Dad isn't looking." Before Maxwell could process what was happening, the two children had disappeared down the corridor, Lucas propelling his wheelchair with newfound vigor and Ember running alongside him. "They certainly hit it off," Maxwell commented, gesturing for Mrs. Reynolds to follow him to the sitting room. "Ember has that effect on people," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice tinged with pride as she carefully lowered herself onto an expensive leather sofa. "She's been through so much, yet she still sees the world as a place full of wonder." Maxwell poured them both a glass of wine. "Lucas mentioned she lives with you, along with other children?" Mrs. Reynolds nodded, taking a small sip of her wine. "Yes, I've been a foster mother for over 30 years now. Ember came to me 3 years ago after the fire." "The fire?" Maxwell inquired, his interest piqued. "A terrible tragedy," Mrs. Reynolds said softly. "Her parents didn't make it. Ember was saved by a firefighter who heard her calling for help. She bounced between 3 foster homes before she came to me. Each family found her too spirited, too full of energy. But that's exactly what makes her special." Maxwell thought about the vibrant little girl who had somehow broken through his son's shell of isolation. She certainly seems special. Lucas has changed since meeting her. "He's more present." Mrs. Reynolds smiled knowingly. "Children have a way of seeing past the barriers we adults construct. Ember doesn't see Lucas's wheelchair, she just sees a friend." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter, echoing from the hallway. Lucas and Ember appeared in the doorway, both slightly out of breath. "Dad, Ember wants to know if we can have dinner in the garden instead of the dining room, can we? Please?" Lucas pleaded, his eyes alight with excitement. Maxwell hesitated. The staff had spent hours preparing the formal dining room, but looking at his son's hopeful face, an expression he hadn't seen in so long, he found he couldn't refuse. "Of course," he said, surprising himself with how easily he acquiesced. "I'll have the staff set up outside." Dinner in the garden proved to be the right decision. Under the warm glow of string lights, with the New York skyline twinkling in the distance, the formal meal Maxwell had planned transformed into something much more magical. Lucas ate more than Maxwell had seen him eat in months, encouraged by Ember's dramatic stories about the other foster children at Mrs. Reynolds' home. And then, Tommy put a frog in Sarah's shoe, and she screamed so loud the neighbors came to check if we were okay, Ember recounted, causing Lucas to nearly choke on his lemonade from laughter. Maxwell found himself laughing too, drawn into the children's world in a way he hadn't been since before the accident. As the evening progressed, he observed Mrs. Reynolds more carefully. Despite her cheerful demeanor, he noticed the way she discreetly pressed a hand to her side when she thought no one was looking, the slight grimace that flashed across her face when she shifted in her chair. After dessert, when the children had moved to another part of the garden to look at stars, Maxwell addressed his observations. "Mrs. Reynolds, forgive me for being forward, but are you feeling all right? You seem to be in some discomfort." Mrs. Reynolds's smile faltered slightly. "Nothing gets past you, does it, Mr. Thornton? I suppose that's how you built your empire." She sighed. "I have pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago." Maxwell was taken aback by her candor. "I'm so sorry. Does Ember know?" "She knows I'm sick. Not how sick." Mrs. Reynolds looked over at the children, who were now lying on the grass, pointing at constellations. "That's why I bring her to the park as often as I can. I want her to make connections, to build relationships that will outlast me." Maxwell felt a pang in his chest. What will happen to her, to all your foster children, when... He couldn't finished the sentence, but Mrs. Reynolds understood. "The system will place them elsewhere. That's what keeps me up at night, Mr. Thornton. Not the pain, not the fear of what's coming for me, but the thought of what will happen to them. Especially Amber. She's been rejected so many times already." Maxwell's gaze drifted to where Lucas and Amber were now engaged in an animated conversation, Lucas gesturing enthusiastically toward the sky. "She's changed my son's life, you know. Before he met her, he barely spoke. He just existed. But now he's living again." "They've been good for each other," Mrs. Reynolds agreed. "Amber needs stability as much as Lucas needs joy. They found in each other what they were missing." The evening ended with promises to meet again soon. As Maxwell watched the taxi carrying Mrs. Reynolds and Amber disappear down the driveway, he felt a strange sense of unease. The thought of Amber being shuttled to yet another foster home, possibly one that wouldn't understand her vibrant spirit, disturbed him deeply. Later that night, after helping Lucas get ready for bed, something he usually left to the night nurse, Maxwell sat beside his son's bed. "Did you have fun tonight, buddy?" Lucas nodded sleepily. "Amber knows all the constellations, Dad. She taught me about Orion and the Big Dipper. Did you know stars are actually giant balls of gas burning billions of miles away?" Amber said her dad told her that before he went to heaven. Maxwell felt his throat tighten. Her dad sounds like he was a smart man. "Dad?" Lucas's voice had grown serious. "Mrs. Reynolds is sick, isn't she? I heard her coughing a lot, and she looks tired like Mom did before she went to heaven." Maxwell was stunned by his son's perceptiveness. "Yes, Lucas, she is sick. What will happen to Amber if Mrs. Reynolds goes to heaven, too?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Maxwell had been asking himself the same thing all evening. "I don't know, buddy," he admitted, "but we'll make sure she's okay, I promise." As Lucas drifted off to sleep, Maxwell remained by his bedside, his mind racing. An idea was forming, one that seemed both completely irrational and absolutely necessary. He thought about Lucas's transformation since meeting Amber, about Mrs. Reynolds' limited time, about Amber's uncertain future. The next morning, Maxwell made a call to his lawyer. "I need information on foster care and adoption procedures," he said without preamble, "and I need it fast." What Maxwell didn't know was that across town, in a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, Amber's biological grandparents, Richard and Eleanor Sullivan, were having a similar conversation with their own lawyer. After years of absence from their granddaughter's life, they had suddenly developed an interest in becoming her guardians, an interest that would soon collide with Maxwell's own plans and set the stage for a battle none of them could have anticipated. Chapter: Constellations of Connection. The following weeks brought a significant shift to the Thornton household. Lucas's bedroom walls, once stark and bare, now featured hand-drawn constellations and planets. His bookshelf, previously filled with untouched volumes, now overflowed with astronomy books that Maxwell had purchased after noticing his son's newfound interest. And the mansion's schedule, once dictated entirely by Maxwell's business demands, now revolved around park visits and playdates with Amber. Maxwell found himself canceling meetings, rescheduling conference calls, and even delegating important decisions to his executive team, actions that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Jeremy Watson, his right-hand man at Horizon Innovations, was both surprised and concerned by the change. "You've missed 3 board meetings in 2 weeks, Max," Jeremy pointed out during a rare appearance by Maxwell at the office. "The shareholders are getting nervous. They're used to you being at the helm 24/7. Maxwell continued reviewing documents, his mind half focused on the task at hand and half on the promise he'd made to Lucas to be home in time for dinner with Amber and Mrs. Reynolds. "The company won't collapse if I take a few evenings off, Jeremy. This is about that foster kid, isn't it? The one Lucas has been hanging out with?" Maxwell's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Her name is Amber, and yes, she's become important to Lucas, which means she's important to me." Jeremy raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not judging. It's just, you've changed, Max. Ever since Catherine's passing and Lucas's accident, you threw yourself into work like it was the only thing keeping you afloat. Now suddenly, you're leaving early, taking days off. Maybe I'm finally realizing there's more to life than quarterly reports, Maxwell replied, gathering his papers. I'll review these at home. Tell the board I'll call in to the next meeting. As Maxwell drove home, Jeremy's words echoed in his mind. He had changed. The accident that left Lucas paralyzed had plunged him into a sea of guilt and grief, compounded by the loss of Catherine 2 years earlier. Work had become his refuge, a place where he could exert control in a world that had spun so chaotically out of his grasp. But Ember's appearance in their lives had altered that equation. Through her, Maxwell was rediscovering his son, and perhaps himself as well. Arriving home, Maxwell found Lucas and Ember in the mansion's library, surrounded by books and star charts. Mrs. Reynolds sat nearby in an armchair, looking frailer than she had just weeks ago. Maxwell noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she sipped her tea. "Dad," Lucas called excitedly, "Ember and I are planning a stargazing night. Can we use the rooftop terrace? Ember says that's the best place to see the stars because we'll be above some of the city lights." Maxwell smiled, setting down his briefcase. "That sounds like a great idea. We can set up the telescope I bought you for Christmas that's been gathering dust." "You have a telescope?" Ember's eyes widened. "A real one? Not just the kiddie kind from the toy store?" "A Celestron Edge HD 8, actually," Maxwell replied, enjoying her excitement. "It's quite powerful." "Wow," Ember breathed, looking at Lucas with awe. "Your dad is the coolest." The pride that swelled in Maxwell's chest at those words caught him by surprise. When was the last time anyone had called him cool? Certainly not since becoming the hard-driving CEO known for his ruthless business tactics. "Mrs. Reynolds," Maxwell said, turning to the elderly woman, "would you join us for dinner? You look like you could use a good meal." Mrs. Reynolds smiled weakly. "That's very kind, but I'm afraid I'm not feeling up to it today. In fact, I was about to call a taxi to take us home." "Nonsense," Maxwell insisted. "My driver can take you home whenever you're ready, but there's no rush. And if you're not feeling well, perhaps Ember could stay for dinner. I can have her brought home afterward." The relief on Mrs. Reynolds' face was evident. "That would be a great help, Mr. Thornton." "Thank you." After arranging for his driver to take Mrs. Reynolds home, Maxwell found himself alone with the children for dinner. It was a novel experience, one that would have terrified him just weeks ago. Now, he found himself enjoying their animated conversation, their unfiltered perspectives, their easy laughter. "Mr. Thornton," Ember asked suddenly. Her fork paused midway to her mouth. "Did you always want to be a businessman?" The question caught Maxwell off guard. "No, actually. When I was about your age, I wanted to be an astronaut." Lucas looked up in surprise. "You did? You never told me that." A pang of regret hit Maxwell. How many things had he never shared with his son? How many conversations had they missed because he was always too busy, too distracted, too afraid to face the pain of their fractured family? "Yes, I was fascinated by space," Maxwell continued. "My sister and I used to camp out in our backyard, with a little telescope much like you two are planning to do." "You have a sister?" Lucas asked, his surprise deepening. Maxwell's expression clouded. "I had a sister, Elizabeth. She went to heaven when we were teenagers." The table fell, silent. Maxwell rarely spoke about Elizabeth, even with Lucas. The loss was a wound that had never properly healed, only scabbed over with time and deliberate avoidance. "I'm sorry about your sister," Ember said softly, her green eyes full of understanding beyond her years. "My mom and dad went to heaven too. Sometimes I talk to them when I look at the stars. Mrs. Reynolds says that's where people go when they leave us." Maxwell felt his throat tighten. "That's a nice thought. Maybe your sister is friends with my parents up there," Ember continued, her face brightening. "Maybe they're all watching us right now, having a star party." The childish innocence of her statement broke through something in Maxwell. A chuckle escaped him, then another, until he was laughing genuinely for what felt like the first time in years. Lucas joined in, and soon all three were laughing. The moment of sadness transformed into something lighter. After dinner, Maxwell found himself doing something unprecedented, helping Lucas with his bedtime routine. As he adjusted his son's position in bed, Lucas looked up at him with serious eyes. "Dad?" I'm glad Ember is our friend now. She makes everything better. Maxwell nodded, smoothing the blanket. She certainly does. Mrs. Reynolds is getting really sick, isn't she? Lucas asked quietly. Maxwell hesitated, then decided on honesty. Yes, she is. What will happen to Ember when Mrs. Reynolds can't take care of her anymore? The question Maxwell had been asking himself for weeks now hung in the air between them. I'm not sure, buddy, but I've been thinking about that a lot. Could she stay with us? Lucas's question was tentative but hopeful. We have lots of room, and she makes us happy. Maxwell sat on the edge of the bed, considering his words carefully. It's not that simple, Lucas. Ember is in foster care. There are legal processes, rules about who can take care of children without parents. But you're rich and smart. Can't you figure it out? The childlike faith in his father's abilities both touched and terrified Maxwell. I'm trying, he admitted. I've been talking to lawyers about what options we might have. Lucas's face lit up. Really, so Ember could be like my sister? I don't want to make promises I can't keep, Maxwell cautioned, though his heart ached at his son's excitement. This is very complicated, and we don't know if it's what Ember would want. It is, Lucas said with absolute certainty. She told me she wishes she could stay in one place forever. She's tired of moving all the time, and she likes it here. She told me so. Maxwell tucked his son in, mind racing with possibilities and complications. Get some sleep, buddy. We'll figure this out. The next morning, Maxwell made another call to his lawyer, this time with more specific instructions. I want to begin the process to become a foster parent, with the intention to adopt, he said, decisively. Specifically, I'm interested in fostering Ember Sullivan, currently in Martha Reynolds' care. That's a significant undertaking, Mr. Thornton, his lawyer cautioned. The process is extensive. Background checks, home studies, parenting classes, and there's no guarantee you'd be approved to foster this specific child. I understand. But I want to try. What Maxwell didn't know was that across the city, Richard and Eleanor Sullivan had moved beyond just consulting with their lawyer. They had officially filed for custody of their granddaughter, setting in motion a legal battle that would soon force everyone to confront painful truths and make impossible choices. Later that week, Maxwell invited Mrs. Reynolds and Ember to his office at Horizon Innovations. As Ember marveled at the view from the top floor of the skyscraper, Maxwell broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. Mrs. Reynolds, I've been giving a lot of thought to Ember's situation, he began carefully. I know your health is declining, and I'm concerned about what will happen to her. Mrs. Reynolds nodded wearily. As am I, Mr. Thornton. The social worker has been vague about placement options. The foster system is overwhelmed, and Ember's energetic personality makes her a challenging placement. Maxwell took a deep breath. I want to apply to become her foster parent with the eventual goal of adoption. The words hung in the air between them. Mrs. Reynolds studied him intently, her expression unreadable. That's a very generous offer, she said finally. But are you sure? Taking on a child, especially one with Ember's history, is no small thing. I've never been more certain of anything, Maxwell replied firmly. She's brought life back to my home, joy back to my son. And I think we could give her the stability she deserves. Mrs. Reynolds' eyes filled with tears. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another wealthy man playing at charity. But I see now how much you care for that child. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. There's something you should know, though. Ember's grandparents have suddenly reappeared in the picture. Maxwell felt his stomach drop. Grandparents? But I thought she had no family. They were estranged from Ember's parents. Never even met her until after the fire. They visited once, decided she was too much to handle, and disappeared again. Now suddenly, they're filing for custody. Why now? Maxwell asked, anger rising in his chest. Mrs. Reynolds shrugged. Who knows? Maybe they've had a change of heart. Or maybe they heard about my illness and realized Ember might end up back in the system. Maxwell's mind raced. Grandparents would have a strong legal claim, certainly stronger than his, a man with no biological connection to Ember. but he couldn't bear the thought of her being taken away from Lucas, from the connection they'd formed. "What can I do?" he asked, determination hardening his voice. "Fight," Mrs. Reynolds said simply. "If you truly believe you can give her the home she needs, then fight for her. But know this, it won't be easy, and Ember will be caught in the middle." Chapter 4. Legal Constellations. The law offices of Harper, Whitfield and Associates occupied the entire 47th floor of a sleek Manhattan skyscraper. Maxwell Thornton sat rigidly in a leather chair across from Patricia Harper, one of New York's most formidable family law attorneys. The panoramic views of the city stretched out behind her, but Maxwell's attention was fixed solely on the folder she was reviewing. "Mr. Thornton, I want to be clear about what we're up against," Patricia said, her voice precise and measured. "The Sullivan grandparents have significant advantages in this case. Blood relation is given considerable weight in family court." Maxwell leaned forward, "But they abandoned her. Mrs. Reynolds said they visited once and then disappeared for years." Patricia nodded. "That will certainly factor into the judge's decision. However, they're claiming they needed time to grieve their son and daughter-in-law, to put their finances in order, and to prepare their home for a child. On paper, they appear to be concerned grandparents ready to provide a stable home." "And what do I appear to be?" Maxwell asked, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "An extremely wealthy man with significant resources but limited time, whose interest in this child coincides with his son's. Needs rather than the child's." Patricia's bluntness was why Maxwell had hired her. She wouldn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. "That's not fair," Maxwell protested. "Yes, Ember has been good for Lucas, but I genuinely care about what happens to her." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, but we need to convince the judge. Your work schedule, the fact that you're a single father already dealing with a child with special needs, and your lack of prior relationship with Ember, these all present challenges. What can we do?" "First, we need to establish your commitment to fostering Ember," Patricia explained. "I recommend you begin the foster parent certification process immediately. Complete the required training. Open your home to inspection. Demonstrate that you're serious about this." Maxwell nodded, making mental notes. "What else?" "We need to understand more about the Sullivans, their history, their relationship with Ember's parents, why they truly stayed away so long. My investigator is already looking into this. And Mrs. Reynolds, will her support help our case?" Patricia tapped her pen thoughtfully against the desk. "Absolutely. As Ember's current foster parent, her recommendation carries significant weight. But..." She hesitated. "But what?" "Her health is deteriorating rapidly, Mr. Thornton. The social worker's reports indicate she may soon be unable to care for any children, let alone testify effectively in court." Maxwell felt a pang of sadness. In just a few short weeks, he had come to respect and care for the elderly woman who had given Ember a stable home when no one else would. "There's one more thing," Patricia added, her tone grave. "The court will appoint a guardian ad litem for Ember, an advocate who determines what's in her best interest. This person will speak with Ember, with you, with the Sullivans, observe your interactions and make a recommendation to the judge." "When will this person be appointed?" "They already have been. Meredith Jackson. She's thorough, fair, and puts children's needs above all else. Your first meeting with her is next week." Maxwell left the meeting with a heavy heart, but a renewed determination. The legal battle ahead would be complex, but he refused to give up without fighting for the little girl who had brought so much light back into his and Lucas's lives. When he returned home that evening, he found Lucas and Ember in the garden, using sticks to draw an elaborate map in the dirt. Lucas was directing from his wheelchair while Ember enthusiastically executed his vision. "It's Treasure Island," Lucas explained when he spotted his father. "We're making our own version with hidden pirate gold and a secret cave." Maxwell smiled, crouching down to examine their creation. "Very impressive. Where did you get the idea?" "Mrs. Reynolds has been reading us Treasure Island at bedtime," Ember piped up. "But she keeps falling asleep before the good parts. so Lucas and I decided to make up our own ending. Speaking of Mrs. Reynolds, how is she feeling today? Maxwell asked carefully. Ember's bright expression dimmed slightly. She's really tired. She couldn't even come to the park today, so your driver picked me up instead. She said she just needed to rest, but the little girl's voice trailed off, her usual confidence wavering. Maxwell placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm sure a good rest will help her feel better. Ember nodded, but the worry in her eyes remained. Maxwell realized with a jolt that despite her youthful exuberance, Ember was keenly aware of Mrs. Reynolds's declining health. She had already lost so much in her young life. Now she faced losing another person she loved. Hey, Maxwell said, trying to lighten the mood. How about we make a real map of Treasure Island? I have some large paper in my office and we could use markers, even add some glitter. Ember's face lit up instantly. Glitter makes everything better. Can we use gold glitter for the treasure? The three spent the evening creating an elaborate treasure map, complete with compass rose, sea monsters, and X marks the spot in gold glitter. Maxwell found himself fully engaged in the activity, his worries about the custody battle temporarily forgotten as he watched Lucas and Ember collaborate, for their excitement infectious. Later, after Ember had been driven home and Lucas was getting ready for bed, Maxwell's phone rang. It was Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Thornton, she said, her voice weaker than he had ever heard it. I need to speak with you. In person. It's important. The urgency in her tone alarmed him. Of course, should I come to you? Please, tomorrow morning if possible. There are things you need to know. About Ember, about her grandparents. Things that might help you. The next morning, Maxwell arrived at Mrs. Reynolds's modest brownstone in Queens. The house was worn but meticulously maintained, with children's artwork covering nearly every available wall space. Mrs. Reynolds greeted him at the door, leaning heavily on a walker, her face drawn with pain, but her eyes sharp as ever. Thank you for coming, she said, leading him slowly to a small sitting room where a teenage girl was helping younger children with breakfast. Sarah, can you take the little ones upstairs to play? Mr. Thornton and I need to talk. Once they were alone, Mrs. Reynolds sank gratefully into an armchair. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe a month, she said without preamble. I've made arrangements for most of my foster children, but Ember is special. She needs someone who understands her spirit, who won't try to dim her light. I want to be that person, Maxwell said earnestly. But the Sullivans, Richard and Eleanor Sullivan, Mrs. Reynolds interrupted, her voice suddenly hard. They're not what they seem, Mr. Thornton. They never approved of their son's marriage, thought his wife wasn't good enough for him. After the fire, they came once to see Ember. Do you know what Eleanor said? She said Ember was too much like her mother, too wild, too emotional. They left and never contacted her again until they heard I was ill. Maxwell frowned. How did they even know you were ill? The system, Mrs. Reynolds sighed. When my doctor informed social services about my prognosis, they started looking at alternative placements for all my kids. Someone must have contacted the Sullivans as potential kin placement for Ember. And suddenly they're interested, Maxwell concluded, anger simmering inside him. Exactly. But there's more. Mrs. Reynolds reached for a worn photo album on the side table. Ember's mother kept a journal. After the fire, it was given to Ember along with a few salvaged possessions. She can't read all of it yet. The handwriting is difficult, but I've been reading parts to her at bedtime. She handed Maxwell a leather-bound journal. I think you should read this, particularly the entries from the last year before the fire. Maxwell accepted the journal hesitantly. Are you sure? This seems very personal. Ember's mother would want her daughter protected, Mrs. Reynolds said firmly. And I believe this journal contains information that could help your case. That night, after ensuring Lucas was asleep, Maxwell sat in his study and opened the journal. The handwriting was flowing and expressive, much like Ember herself. As he read, a disturbing picture emerged of the Sullivans' relationship with their son's family. Entries described emotional manipulation, attempts to control their son's life, and, most disturbingly, complete rejection of their granddaughter. Richard and Eleanor visited today. Eleanor spent the entire time criticizing everything. Ember's wild behavior, my parenting, even the lunch I prepared. When Ember showed them her art project, Richard barely looked at it. They left early, with Eleanor commenting that Ember needs proper discipline and structure. My heart breaks seeing Ember's confusion. She just wants their approval, but nothing she does is ever good enough. Maxwell read until the early hours of the morning, his resolve strengthening with each page. When he finally closed the journal, he knew with absolute certainty that he could not allow Ember to be placed with the Sullivans. The next day brought another development. Meredith Jackson, Ember's court-appointed guardian ad litem, had moved up their meeting and would be arriving at the Thornton mansion that afternoon. Maxwell barely had time to prepare, to think about how to present himself as a suitable guardian for Ember. When Meredith arrived, she wasn't at all what Maxwell had expected. Rather than the stern, bureaucratic figure he'd imagined, she was a warm African-American woman in her 50s with an easy smile and observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Mr. Thornton," she said, shaking his hand firmly, "thank you for accommodating my schedule change. I believe in seeing potential placements in their natural environment, not just during carefully orchestrated visits." Maxwell appreciated her directness. "Of course, please make yourself at home." The next few hours were both exhausting and enlightening. Meredith toured the mansion, asked probing questions about Maxwell's work schedule, his support system, his plans for balancing Lucas's needs with Ember's. She observed Lucas in his physical therapy session, noting the adaptations made to the home for his wheelchair. When Ember arrived after school, Meredith watched their interaction without interference, taking careful notes. "They have a special bond," Meredith commented later, as they watched the children playing a board game in the living room. "That's evident. But raising a child isn't just about fun and games, Mr. Thornton. It's about consistency, emotional support, being present even when it's difficult." "I'm aware," Maxwell replied, choosing his words carefully. "I've made significant changes to my work schedule already. My priority now is being here for Lucas and for Ember, if I'm given the chance." Meredith studied him thoughtfully. Why her? There are thousands of children in foster care in New York City alone. Why this particular child? It was the question Maxwell had been asking himself for weeks. Why Ember? Why this fiery, spirited little girl who had crashed into their lives so unexpectedly? "Because she sees Lucas," he said finally. "Not his wheelchair, not his limitations, she sees him, and in doing so she taught me to see him too." He paused, emotion welling up unexpectedly. "And because I think we can give her what she needs, stability, acceptance, a place where her spirit isn't something to be tamed but celebrated." Meredith nodded, her expression giving nothing away. "I'll be speaking with the Sullivans tomorrow, and with Mrs. Reynolds. My report to the court will reflect all perspectives." As she prepared to leave, Meredith had one final question. "Have you discussed any of this with Ember? Does she understand what's happening?" Maxwell shook his head. "Not fully. I didn't want to create anxiety or put pressure on her. She knows Mrs. Reynolds is very ill, but we haven't discussed long-term arrangements." "She'll need to be included in this process, Mr. Thornton," Meredith advised. "Children are remarkably resilient and perceptive. Ember deserves to know that her future is being decided and to have her voice heard in that decision." After Meredith left, Maxwell stood at the window watching the children play, wrestling with how to broach such a complex topic with an 8-year-old who had already experienced so much loss and uncertainty. But as he observed Ember's animated gestures, her boundless energy, her kindness toward Lucas, he knew Meredith was right. Ember deserved a voice in her own future. The real question was whether the courts would listen to that voice, and whether Maxwell's fight for guardianship would provide Ember with the stability she needed, or simply add another layer of conflict to her already complicated young life. Chapter 5. Divided Skies. The Manhattan Family Court building stood imposingly on Lafayette Street, its bureaucratic architecture a stark contrast to the emotional battles waged within its walls. Maxwell sat stiffly in the wood-paneled courtroom, hyper-aware of every sound. The rustling of papers, the occasional cough, the quiet murmurs between attorneys. Across the aisle sat Richard and Eleanor Sullivan, both in their 60s, impeccably, dressed in conservative attire that screamed respectability. Eleanor caught Maxwell's gaze and gave him a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was something calculated in her expression that made Maxwell's skin crawl. Richard simply stared straight ahead, his jaw set in determination. Patricia Harper leaned over to whisper in Maxwell's ear. "Remember, stay calm no matter what. They say, judges look for emotional stability in potential guardians." Maxwell nodded, though calm was the furthest thing from what he felt. This preliminary hearing would set the tone for the entire custody battle. Martha Reynolds, too ill to attend in person, had submitted written testimony supporting Maxwell's petition for guardianship. Now everything hinged on the impression he made on Judge Gloria Ramirez, a veteran family court judge known for her no-nonsense approach. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Ramirez entered the courtroom. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone in the room simultaneously. After the formalities, the Sullivans' attorney, Bradford Collins, presented their case first. His voice oozed confidence, as he painted a picture of devoted grandparents eager to provide their only grandchild with a loving home. "Your Honor, blood ties are sacred in our society," Collins argued. "The Sullivans are Ember's only living relatives. They have prepared a lovely bedroom in their Washington home, researched the best schools in their district, and are prepared to dedicate their retirement years to raising their son's child. They offer stability, family history, and genetic connection that no one else can provide." Judge Ramirez listened impassively, occasionally making notes. "And yet they have had minimal contact with the child for the past 3 years. Is that correct?" "Mr. Collins?" Collins cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Following the tragic loss of their son and daughter-in-law, the Sullivans were overwhelmed with grief. They needed time to process their own loss before taking on the responsibility of raising a child. They now recognize that their absence was a mistake and are committed to making amends." When it was Patricia's turn, she approached the podium with purposeful confidence. "Your Honor, while we respect the Sullivans' biological connection to Ember, we must consider what is truly in the child's best interest. Mr. Thornton has developed a significant bond with Ember over the past several months. His son Lucas and Ember have formed a sibling-like relationship that has been healing for both children. Moreover, Ember's current foster mother, Martha Reynolds, who has cared for her longer than anyone else in her young life, strongly supports Mr. Thornton's petition." Patricia then introduced Martha Reynolds' written statement, which detailed not only her support for Maxwell, but also her concerns about the Sullivans based on their previous interactions with Ember. "Mrs. Reynolds has observed firsthand how Ember thrives in Mr. Thornton's home," Patricia continued. "She has also witnessed the dismissive attitude the Sullivans displayed toward Ember during their brief visit 3 years ago. Mrs. Reynolds reports that after that visit, Ember experienced nightmares and behavioral regression, clear signs of emotional distress." Bradford Collins jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is hearsay and attempts to malign my client's character without substantial evidence." "Your Honor," Patricia countered, "Mrs. Reynolds' observations as Ember's long-term foster mother are relevant to understanding the child's relationship history with all parties involved." Judge Ramirez considered briefly. "I'll allow it, but be aware that I will give appropriate weight to second-hand accounts." As the hearing continued, Maxwell found himself growing increasingly tense. The legal arguments felt cold and detached, compared to the warm reality of his connection with Ember. How could strangers in a courtroom possibly understand what that little girl had come to mean to him and Lucas? When Meredith Jackson was called to present her findings as guardian ad litem, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her report would carry significant weight with the judge. "I've had the opportunity to observe Ember in multiple settings," Meredith began, her voice measured and clear. "With Mrs. Reynolds, with Mr. Thornton and his son, and most recently with Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan during a supervised visit." She detailed her observations methodically, noting Ember's comfort level and behavior in each environment. "With Mrs., Reynolds and at the Thornton home, Ember displays the secure attachment behaviors we hope to see in children: comfortable exploration, appropriate affection, and the ability to express both positive and negative emotions freely. Her relationship with Lucas Thornton is particularly noteworthy. They have developed a mutual support system that benefits them both. Maxwell felt a flicker of hope at these words, but it was quickly dampened by what came next. During the supervised visit with the Sullivans, Meredith continued, Ember was initially withdrawn but gradually warmed up, especially when Mrs. Sullivan shared photos and stories about Ember's father as a child. These connections to her family history appeared meaningful to Ember. Meredith then delivered her recommendation. Given the complexity of this case, a terminally ill foster mother, biological grandparents with limited prior contact but strong family ties, and a non-relative with a significant recent bond, I believe a transitional approach would best serve Ember's interests. I recommend a shared guardianship arrangement initially, with Ember spending time in both households while a permanent placement is determined. Maxwell felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Shared guardianship, with people who had abandoned Ember for years, people who, according to her mother's journal, had never fully accepted her. Judge Ramirez questioned Meredith extensively about her recommendation before turning to address the parties directly. "This is a complex case with no perfect solution," she said, her expression grave. "I'm inclined to follow Ms. Jackson's recommendation for a transitional period. Ember will divide her time between the Sullivan home in Washington and the Thornton home in New York, with evaluations every 60 days to assess her adjustment and well-being." The judge then outlined a detailed schedule: 2 weeks with the Sullivans, 2 weeks with Maxwell, with transitions occurring on Sunday evenings. Both parties would need to facilitate video calls with the non-custodial household 3 times weekly, and neither was to speak negatively about the other in Ember's presence. "This arrangement begins next Sunday," Judge Ramirez concluded. "We will reconvene in 4 months to reassess. In the meantime, I expect all parties to prioritize Ember's emotional well-being above their own desires or convenience." As the court adjourned, Maxwell sat stunned, barely registering Patricia's reassurances that this was just the first step, that they had 4 months to demonstrate that Ember belonged with the Thorntons. Outside the courtroom, Richard Sullivan approached Maxwell, his wife hanging back slightly. "Mr. Thornton," he said stiffly, "I appreciate your concern for our granddaughter, but surely you understand that blood counts for something in this world." Maxwell met his gaze steadily. "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, blood ties didn't seem to count for much during the 3 years you were absent from Ember's life." Richard's face hardened. "We made mistakes. We're trying to correct them now." "At whose expense?" Maxwell asked quietly. "Ember's stability? Her happiness? She's not a possession to be claimed. She's a child who's already experienced more loss and disruption than most adults. Which is precisely why she needs her family," Eleanor interjected, stepping forward. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and pearl necklace created an image of grandmotherly perfection, but there was steel in her voice. "We can give her roots a sense of where she came from. What can you give her, Mr. Thornton? A distraction for your crippled son?" Maxwell felt rage surge through him at her callous reference to Lucas, but Patricia's warning echoed in his mind. "Stay calm." He took a deep breath. "I can give her acceptance," he said evenly. "Something I'm not convinced you're capable of. Given your history." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You know nothing about our history." "I know more than you think," Maxwell replied, thinking of the journal entries he'd read. "And I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to ensure Ember isn't hurt by your sudden interest in playing grandparents." The conversation was interrupted by Patricia, who gently pulled Maxwell away. "This isn't productive," she murmured. "We need to focus on preparing for the transition." The next week passed in a blur of preparations. Maxwell converted one of the guest bedrooms into a permanent space for Ember, letting her choose the colors and decorations. They settled on a space theme, with deep blue walls adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars and planets. Lucas insisted on helping, directing the placement of furniture from his wheelchair and creating a special welcome sign for the door. Maxwell also arranged for a child psychologist to meet with both children to help them understand the court's decision and prepare for the transitions ahead. Dr. Sophie Chen was gentle but straightforward as she explained the situation to Ember. "So I'll live in two different places?" Ember asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Like having two homes?" "That's right," Dr. Chen confirmed. 2 weeks with Mr. Thornton and Lucas here in New York, and 2 weeks with your grandparents in Washington." "But what about Mrs. Reynolds?" Ember's voice quavered slightly. "She's my home too." The adults exchanged pained glances. Martha's condition had deteriorated rapidly. She was now in hospice care. They had explained to Ember that Mrs. Reynolds was very sick and needed special care, but the full reality of the situation had been softened. "Mrs. Reynolds will always be in your heart," Dr. Chen said gently, "and you can visit her whenever. You're in New York?" Ember seemed to consider this, twisting a strand of her fiery hair around her finger, a habit Maxwell had noticed she displayed when anxious. "What if I don't like it at my grandparents'?" she finally asked. "They're different. When they visited before, Grandma Eleanor said I was too loud and messy." Maxwell had to turn away to hide his reaction to this confirmation of what Martha and the journal had suggested. When he composed himself and looked back, Lucas had wheeled his chair closer to Ember and was holding her hand. "If you don't like it, you can tell the judge," Lucas said with childlike certainty. "And then you can just stay with us all the time." Dr. Chen gently corrected this oversimplification, explaining that the judge would consider Ember's feelings but would make the final decision based on what she thought was best for Ember. The night before Ember was to leave for Washington, Maxwell found her in the observatory he had built on the mansion's rooftop. She was peering through the telescope, her small face serious in concentration. "Finding any new stars?" he asked, joining her. Ember looked up, her green eyes reflecting the ambient light. "I'm trying to find Sirius. Lucas showed me where it is, but I can't see it tonight." Maxwell adjusted the telescope slightly. "There's too much cloud cover tonight. But it's still there, even if we can't see it." Ember nodded, seeming to find comfort in this fact. "Mr. Thornton, when I'm at my grandparents' house, will you and Lucas still be here? Will you wait for me to come back?" The question broke Maxwell's heart. This child, who had already lost so much, was now worried about losing the newest people in her life. "Ember, look at me," he said, kneeling down to her level. "Lucas and I will always be here for you. No matter what happens, no matter where you live, you have a place with us. Do you understand?" Ember nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared," she admitted in a small voice. "What if they don't like me? What if I do something wrong?" Maxwell pulled her into a gentle hug, letting her tears dampen his shirt. "You could never do anything wrong just by being yourself, Ember. And if they can't see how amazing you are exactly as you are, then that's their loss, not yours." He held her until her tears subsided, then walked her back to her room where Lucas was waiting, determined to spend every possible moment with his friend before she left. As Maxwell closed the door on the two children, their heads bent together over a book of constellations, he made a silent vow. He would fight with everything he had to give this bright, beautiful child the home she deserved, one where her spirit could soar freely, unbound by anyone's expectations or limitations. What he didn't know was that the Sullivans were making their own plans, ones that would test not only his legal rights, but his understanding of what it truly meant to love a child who wasn't his own. Chapter 6. The Secret Constellations. The Sullivan home in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., was exactly as Maxwell had imagined it, a meticulously maintained federal-style townhouse with pristine white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything about it screamed order, control, and old money. As he stood on the sidewalk watching the social worker lead Ember up the immaculate brick walkway, Maxwell felt a suffocating tightness in his chest. Ember glanced back at him, her vibrant, her red hair a stark contrast to the subdued elegance of her surroundings. He gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile, but inside he was crumbling. 2 weeks suddenly seemed like an eternity. "Remember, video calls every other day," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "And I'll pick you up myself on the 23rd. Ember nodded, clutching the purple backpack that contained her most treasured possessions, her mother's journal, though she couldn't read all of it yet, a star chart Lucas had made for her, and the small telescope Maxwell had bought as a going-away present. Eleanor Sullivan appeared at the door, her silver, hair perfectly coiffed, her smile polite but cool. She placed a hand on Ember's shoulder as the child reached the top step, and Maxwell couldn't miss the way Ember stiffened at the touch. "We'll take good care of her, Mr. Thornton," Eleanor called, her voice carrying the slight southern accent of old Virginia money. "You needn't worry." But worry was all Maxwell could do as he watched the door close behind them, cutting off his view of Ember's anxious face. The drive back to New York was the longest of his life. Lucas's reaction to Ember's absence was even more heartbreaking. The boy sat by the window of their Manhattan penthouse for hours, staring out at the cityscape as if expecting to see a flash of red hair at any moment. "Dad," he asked on the third evening of Ember's absence, "do you think Ember can see the same stars from Washington that we see here?" Maxwell, who had been reviewing documents for work, a task he'd thrown himself into to distract from the hollow feeling in the house, looked up with surprise. "Yes, pretty much. They might look a little different because there's less light pollution there, but they're the same stars." Lucas seemed to find comfort in this connection. "I'm going to look at Orion's belt tonight and pretend she's looking at it too. Then it's like we're still together, right?" Maxwell felt his throat constrict. "That's a beautiful idea, buddy." That night, they set up the telescope on the rooftop terrace and found Orion's belt gleaming against the night sky. Maxwell sent Ember a text suggesting she look for it too, creating an invisible thread, connecting the three of them across the miles. The scheduled video calls provided both relief and new worries. Ember appeared well cared for, her hair neatly brushed, her clothing obviously new and expensive, but there was a restraint in her manner that hadn't been there before. Her usual exuberance seemed muted, her responses careful and measured. "Grandma Eleanor says I'm taking etiquette lessons," she reported during their third call, pronouncing etiquette with deliberate precision. "I'm learning which fork to use at dinner and how to sit like a proper young lady." Maxwell exchanged a glance with Lucas, who looked as concerned as he felt. "That sounds educational," Maxwell offered neutrally. "Are you having any fun too?" A brief hesitation. "I go to an art class on Tuesdays. The teacher says I have good technique, but I need to stay inside the lines." The Ember they knew had never been one to stay inside any lines, literal or figurative. During the second week of Ember's stay in Washington, Maxwell received an unexpected call from Meredith Jackson. "I conducted my first observation visit with Ember at the Sullivan home yesterday," she explained. "I wanted to touch base with you directly rather than put this in a formal report yet." Maxwell tensed. "What did you observe?" "Nothing overtly concerning," Meredith assured him. "The Sullivans provide excellent material care. Ember has a beautiful room, nutritious meals, educational activities. But," she paused, "but there's a rigidity to their household that seems at odds with Ember's natural temperament. Eleanor Sullivan, in particular, has very defined ideas about how a young lady should behave. During my observation, Ember was reprimanded for speaking too loudly, for sitting improperly, for asking impertinent questions." Maxwell gripped the phone tighter. "That's exactly who Ember is. Curious, enthusiastic, uninhibited. They're trying to change her fundamental nature." "I share your concern," Meredith admitted, "but it's important to understand that different families have different values and parenting styles. The question is whether this environment is actually harmful to Ember or merely different from what she's accustomed to. How can suppressing a child's natural personality not be harmful?" Maxwell challenged. "That's what I'm trying to determine," Meredith replied calmly. "I've requested additional observation visits, including some unannounced ones. In the meantime, I'd suggest focusing on making Ember's transitions as smooth as possible. When the day finally came to bring Ember back to New York, Maxwell arrived at the Sullivan home half an hour early. Unable to contain his anticipation, Richard answered the door, his expression inscrutable. "You're early, Thornton," he remarked dryly. "Traffic was lighter than expected," Maxwell replied, trying to keep his tone civil. "Is Ember ready?" Before Richard could answer, there was the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and Ember appeared in the foyer. Maxwell barely recognized her. Her wild red curls had been tamed into a sleek bob, cut several inches shorter than before. She wore a prim navy blue dress with a white collar, white tights and shiny Mary Jane shoes, an outfit more suited to a child from the 1950s than the vibrant, free-spirited girl he knew. "Hello, Mr. Thornton," she greeted him formally, her voice subdued. Maxwell felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. Where was the child who had bounded into his arms, who had called him Max despite his initial insistence on Mr. Thornton, who had brought such unconstrained joy into their lives? "Ember," he managed, "you cut your hair." "Grandma Eleanor took me to her stylist," Ember explained, one hand self-consciously touching the neat bob. "She said my hair was too unruly before." Eleanor appeared behind Ember, placing her hands on the child's shoulders in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. "Ember has been a delight," she informed Maxwell with a tight smile. "She's made remarkable progress in her deportment and manners." Maxwell bit back the angry retort that rose to his lips. Instead, he knelt to Ember's level. "Are you ready to go? Lucas has been counting the days until you return." For the first time, a genuine smile lit up Ember's face at the mention of Lucas. "I've been counting too. I have so many things to tell him." The drive back to New York was initially quiet, Ember sitting primly in the back seat of Maxwell's car, answering his questions with polite monosyllables. It wasn't until they were halfway home that the dam finally broke. "Mr. Thornton," Ember's voice was small, "does my hair look weird now?" Maxwell glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Not weird at all. It's very neat. But what matters is how you feel about it. Do you like it?" Ember's lower lip trembled slightly. "I miss my curls. Grandma Eleanor said they made me look unkempt, but—" Her voice trailed off. "But what, Ember?" "My mom loved my curls," she whispered. "She used to call me her little flame. Now I don't look like that anymore." Maxwell felt a surge of protective fury. The Sullivans hadn't just cut Ember's hair. They'd cut away a connection to her mother, a part of her identity. "Hair grows back," he assured her gently, "and you'll always be a little flame, no matter what haircut you have. It's not your hair that makes you special, Ember. It's who you are inside." By the time they reached the Thornton penthouse, Ember had gradually relaxed, becoming more like her usual self. When Lucas wheeled himself into the foyer to greet her, his momentary surprise at her new appearance was quickly replaced by pure joy. "Ember, you're back! I found 3 new constellations while you were gone, and Dad got me a book about space exploration. And we need to work on our Treasure Island map because I had some new ideas about the secret cave." Ember's face lit up, her carefully cultivated, proper young lady demeanor evaporating as she hugged Lucas fiercely. "I missed you so much. My grandparents don't know anything about stars, and Grandma Eleanor says imagination games are childish, but I thought about our map every day." Maxwell watched as the 2 children disappeared into the den, already deep in animated conversation. The contrast between the restrained child he'd picked up in Georgetown and this exuberant girl reuniting with her friend couldn't have been more stark. That evening, after both children were asleep, Lucas in his room and Ember in her newly decorated, space-themed bedroom, Maxwell made a difficult phone call. "Patricia, it's Maxwell Thornton. I need you to push for a modification of the custody arrangement. The Sullivans are trying to fundamentally change who Ember is, and I can't stand by and watch it happen." The next morning, Maxwell was awakened by the sound of soft crying. Following the sound, he found Ember sitting on the floor of her bathroom, chunks of her new haircut scattered around her, scissors in hand. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, her amateur attempt at restoring her longer hair having resulted in a jagged, uneven mess. "I just wanted to look like me again," she sobbed. "Grandma Eleanor's going to be so mad when I go back." Maxwell sat down beside her on the cool tile floor, heedless of his expensive pajamas. "Oh, Ember," he sighed, pulling her into a hug. "It's okay. We'll fix this." "How?" she hiccuped against his shoulder. "My hair is ruined, and I'm ruined too. Grandma Eleanor says I'm too wild and too loud and too much like my mum, and that's why no one wants to keep me." Maxwell felt as if his heart might shatter. "Listen to me, Ember Sullivan," he said firmly, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "You are perfect exactly as you are. Your enthusiasm, your imagination, your big voice, your big heart, those aren't things to be fixed or changed. They're what make you special. But, no buts, and Eleanor Sullivan is wrong about something else too. There are people who want to keep you. Lucas and I want you here with us, always." Later that day, Maxwell took Ember to the Best Children's hair salon in Manhattan, where a stylist worked magic on her botched self-haircut, creating a pixie style that somehow emphasized the fiery color and complemented her elfin features. "I look like Tinkerbell," Ember exclaimed, twirling in front of the mirror, her earlier distress forgotten. "Tinkerbell with rocket boosters," Maxwell agreed, relieved to see the sparkle back in her eyes. The 2 weeks with the Thorntons flew by in a blur of activity. Museum visits, science experiments, stargazing sessions, and countless hours of Lucas and Ember lost in their imaginative worlds. Maxwell rearranged his work schedule to be present as much as possible, his priorities having shifted irrevocably since Ember had entered their lives. Patricia Harper was working on their case, gathering evidence of the Sullivans' attempts to reshape Ember's personality and building an argument for full custody. Martha Reynolds, now confined to her bed in hospice care, had recorded a video testimony about Ember's needs and the concerning behavior she had observed from the Sullivans years earlier. 2 days before Ember was scheduled to return to Washington, Maxwell received devastating news. Martha Reynolds had peacefully passed away in her sleep. The loss hit Ember hard. Martha had been the one constant in her life since losing her parents. "She promised she wouldn't leave me," Ember sobbed, curled up in Maxwell's lap. "Everyone leaves me." "She didn't want to leave you," Maxwell murmured, stroking her short red hair, "and she made sure you wouldn't be alone. She found me and Lucas for you." That night, after Ember had finally cried herself to sleep, Maxwell sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The weight of responsibility he felt for this child, a child who wasn't his by birth but had somehow become his by heart, was overwhelming. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Lucas wheeled himself into the room, his expression solemn beyond his years. "Dad, can I talk to you about something important?" Maxwell nodded, setting aside his untouched drink. "Of course, buddy. What's on your mind?" Lucas wheeled closer, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "It's about Ember. She told me things about her grandparents' house, things that made me scared for her." Maxwell leaned forward. "What kind of things?" "She's not allowed to talk about stars or imagination games there. She has to sit for hours practicing piano and having tea lessons, even though she hates it. And..." Lucas hesitated. "And what, Lucas?" "And her grandmother told her that her mom was difficult, just like Ember, and that's why bad. Things happened to her. Ember's been having nightmares about fire every night since she got back." Maxwell felt cold fury rise within him. The psychological manipulation, the implicit blame, the systematic dismantling of a child's sense of self, it was cruelty disguised as proper upbringing. "Thank you for telling me this," Maxwell said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I promise you I'm doing everything I can to make sure Ember stays with us." Lucas nodded solemnly. "Dad, there's something else, something I haven't told anyone." "What is it, son?" Lucas took a deep breath. "The night of my accident, when the car hit us, I saw Mum's face right before everything went black. She looked so scared, Dad, and sometimes I think it should have been me who went to heaven instead of her." The confession hit Maxwell like a physical blow. For 2 years, he had been so consumed by his own guilt over the accident that had claimed Catherine's life and left Lucas paralyzed that he had never realized his son carried a similar burden. "Lucas, no," Maxwell said, moving to kneel beside his son's wheelchair. "Don't ever think that. What happened wasn't your fault, it wasn't anyone's fault, it was a terrible accident. But if I hadn't asked to stop for ice cream—" "Stop," Maxwell interrupted gently. "Your mother adored you. She would have done anything to protect you, and she would be so proud of the brave, compassionate boy you've become. She wouldn't want you carrying this guilt." As father and son embraced, their tears mingling, Maxwell realized something critical. His own inability to process his grief and guilt had created a vacuum that had affected Lucas profoundly. And now, with Ember facing the loss of yet another parental figure and the prospect of returning to a home that sought to extinguish her spirit, the stakes couldn't be higher. That night, while the children slept, Maxwell made a decision. He would fight with everything he had, his wealth, his influence, his determination, to keep Ember with them. But more importantly, he would finally confront his own demons, the ghosts that had haunted him since long before Catherine's accident, reaching back to the traumatic loss of his sister Elizabeth decades ago. Because to be the father that both Lucas and Ember needed, Maxwell would first need to heal the wounded child within himself, the boy who had learned the hard way that loving people meant risking devastating loss. Chapter 7. The Light That Guides Us Home. The day of Martha Reynolds' funeral dawned with a gentle autumn rain that seemed fitting for the occasion. Maxwell stood beneath a black umbrella, Lucas beside him in his wheelchair, and Ember between them, her small hand clutching Maxwell's tightly. The child's pixie haircut was growing out slightly, red wisps curling around her ears as she stared at the polished wooden casket being lowered into the earth. Eleanor and Richard Sullivan stood across from them, their postures rigid, their expressions appropriately solemn. Eleanor had initially objected to Ember attending the funeral, claiming it would be too emotional for a child her age. Maxwell had stood firm, understanding that Ember needed this closure, this chance to say goodbye to the woman who had been her rock for the past 3 years. As the minister spoke of Martha's dedication to children and her lifetime of service, Ember leaned against Maxwell, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Maxwell placed his hand gently on her back, offering quiet support, wishing he could shield her from this pain but knowing he couldn't, and perhaps shouldn't. Learning to grieve, to honor love and loss, was part of living. After the service, as mourners dispersed under a canopy of dripping trees, Eleanor approached, her umbrella held perfectly level. "We'll be taking Ember back to Washington today," she stated, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "She needs stability and routine, especially after such an emotional event." Maxwell felt Ember stiffen beside him. "Actually," he replied calmly, "I've arranged with Meredith Jackson for Ember to remain with us until the weekend." She agreed. It would be best for Ember to have a few days to process Martha's passing in familiar surroundings before transitioning again. Eleanor's lips thinned to a tight line. "I wasn't informed of this change." "Meredith tried calling you yesterday. Perhaps you missed it." Maxwell kept his voice neutral, aware of the children listening intently. "She'll be contacting you to reschedule the exchange for Saturday." Richard joined them, placing a proprietary hand on Ember's shoulder that made her flinch slightly. "Come now, Eleanor. A few more days won't matter in the grand scheme of things. We'll use the time to finish preparing Ember's room." The calculating look that passed between the Sullivans sent a chill down Maxwell's spine. There was something unsaid in that exchange, something that heightened his already considerable anxiety about Ember returning to their care. Back at the Thornton penthouse, Maxwell noticed Ember's unusual quietness as Lucas tried to engage her in their favorite games. She moved through the evening like a small ghost, responding when spoken to but without her usual spark. That night, as Maxwell tucked her into bed beneath her ceiling of glow-in-the-dark stars, she finally spoke what was on her mind. "Mr. Thornton, if I'm really good and quiet and proper at my grandparents' house, do you think they might let me come visit more often?" The question broke his heart. Ember, you should never have to change who you are to be loved and accepted. She picked at a loose thread on her comforter, avoiding his eyes. But Grandma Eleanor says that's how the world works. She says wild girls like me and my mum don't fit in proper society. Maxwell sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. There are many different kinds of proper society, Ember, and the most important thing isn't fitting in. It's finding the people who love you exactly as you are. Like Mrs. Reynolds did? Yes. And like Lucas and I do. Ember's green eyes finally met his, filled with a vulnerability that made her seem younger than her 8 years. But what if the judge says I have to live with my grandparents forever? Will you and Lucas forget about me? Maxwell took her small hands in his. Listen to me, Ember Sullivan. No matter what happens, no matter where you live, Lucas and I will never ever forget about you or stop caring about you. Some connections can't be broken by distance or time or even court orders. Do you understand? She nodded, but the worry remained etched on her face. Maxwell wished he could promise her everything would work out, that she would stay with them permanently, but he couldn't make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. The next day, Maxwell did something he'd been postponing for years. He took a personal day from work and visited his therapist, Dr. Sarah Winters, whom he had stopped seeing shortly after Lucas's accident. "I'm surprised to see you back, Maxwell," Dr. Winters commented as he settled into the familiar leather chair in her office. "It's been, what, almost 2 years?" 20 months, Maxwell confirmed. "I should have come back sooner. What brings you in today?" Maxwell took a deep breath. "I'm fighting for custody of a foster child, a little girl named Ember. She's become important to Lucas and me, but I'm realizing that I can't be what she needs, what both children need, until I address my own issues." For the next hour, Maxwell spoke more openly than he had in years about Elizabeth's accident when they were teenagers, about his parents' emotional collapse afterward, about the walls he had built around his heart to prevent ever feeling such devastating loss again. He talked about how Catherine had somehow breached those walls, only to be taken from him too, leaving him even more convinced that loving deeply meant risking unbearable pain. "I've been so afraid of losing people that I've kept them at arm's length," he admitted. "Even Lucas after the accident, especially Lucas. It was easier to bury myself in work than face the possibility that I could lose him too. And now this little girl, Ember, has disrupted that pattern," Dr. Winters observed. Maxwell nodded. "She reminds me so much of Elizabeth, that same vibrant energy, that fearlessness. When I look at her, I see my sister as she was before the accident, and it hurts. But it also feels like a second chance somehow." "A second chance at what?" "At being the kind of brother I couldn't be for Elizabeth after she was injured. At being present, at not running away from the hard feelings." Maxwell paused, a realization dawning. "Maybe even a second chance at healing that part of myself that's been frozen since she went to heaven." As the session concluded, Dr. Winters regarded him thoughtfully. "Maxwell, you've spent decades building fortifications around your heart, convinced they would protect you from pain. But they've also prevented healing and connection. The fact that Ember and Lucas have found their way through those defenses isn't a vulnerability to be feared. It's a gift to be embraced." Those words stayed with Maxwell as he drove home, as he spent the evening with the children building a complex blanket fort in the living room, something the old Maxwell would never have participated in, and as he lay awake that night contemplating the upcoming court date that would determine Ember's fate. Saturday morning arrived all too soon. Ember's small suitcase sat packed by the door, her expression solemn as she prepared to return to the Sullivan home in Washington. Just as they were about to leave, Lucas wheeled himself into the foyer holding a crudely wrapped package. "I made you something," he told Ember, holding it out. "Dad helped a little, but it was mostly my idea." Ember unwrapped the gift to reveal a handmade book titled The Adventures of Lucas and Ember, Star Explorers. Inside were illustrated pages, depicting the two of them having adventures among the constellations. "See, We're still together even when you're in Washington, Lucas explained earnestly. Because we're looking at the same stars. Ember threw her arms around Lucas, hugging him tightly. This is the best present ever. I'll look at it every night, I promise. The drive to Washington was subdued. Maxwell had hoped to use the time to prepare Ember for her return to the Sullivans, to reassure her of his continued efforts to modify the custody arrangement. But she had fallen asleep almost immediately, emotionally exhausted from the week's events. As they approached Georgetown, Maxwell gently woke her. Ember, we're almost there. I wanted to tell you something important before we arrive. She rubbed her eyes sleepily. What is it? Patricia, my lawyer, has filed a motion to modify the custody arrangement. We're asking the judge to reconsider, to let you stay with us permanently. Ember's eyes widened. Really? You want me to live with you and Lucas forever? More than anything, Maxwell confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. But I need you to understand that these things take time, and there are no guarantees. Your grandparents will fight this, and the judge might still decide that living with them is what's best for you. Ember's face fell slightly. Oh, but, Maxwell continued, no matter what happens in court, I want you to remember something. In here, he tapped his heart, you are already my daughter. Nothing can change that. The words had come spontaneously, surprising even Maxwell, but as soon as he said them, he knew they were true. Somewhere along the way, this vibrant, red-haired child had claimed a permanent piece of his heart. Ember's response was cut short as they pulled up to the Sullivan townhouse. Eleanor and Richard were already waiting on the porch, Eleanor's expression tightening as she noted Ember's casual clothes and growing out pixie cut. The exchange was brief and tense. As Ember reluctantly joined her grandparents, Maxwell handed Eleanor an envelope. These are the court papers for our motion to modify custody, he explained. Our hearing is scheduled for next month. Eleanor's expression hardened, but it was Richard who responded. Mr. Thornton, I admire your attachment to our granddaughter, but you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Blood ties matter in family, court. So does a child's happiness and well-being, Maxwell countered evenly. As he prepared to leave, Ember suddenly broke away from her grandmother and ran back to him, throwing her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. Remember our constellation? She whispered urgently. Look for it tonight. Before Maxwell could ask what she meant, Eleanor had called Ember back sharply, and the child reluctantly obeyed, casting one last meaningful glance over her shoulder as she entered the house. The drive back to New York was the longest of Maxwell's life, his mind replaying Ember's cryptic message. What constellation? They had looked at many together, but she seemed to be referring to a specific one, something meaningful between them. That evening, Maxwell and Lucas set up the telescope on the rooftop terrace, scanning the night sky in silence. Dad, Lucas finally asked, do you think the judge will let Ember stay with us? Maxwell sighed, gazing at the stars twinkling above them. I hope so, buddy. We're doing everything we can. She belongs here, Lucas said with simple certainty. She's part of our constellation. Now, the word triggered something in Maxwell's memory. Our constellation? Lucas nodded, adjusting the telescope. That's what Ember calls us. She says you, me, and her make a constellation like the ones in the sky, connected by invisible lines that no one can see but us. Understanding dawned. Maxwell helped Lucas locate Orion in the night sky, thinking of Ember looking at the same stars from Washington, and felt the invisible bond between them strengthen despite the physical distance. The weeks that followed were filled with legal preparations. Patricia built their case meticulously, gathering testimony from Ember's teachers, from the other foster children who had lived with Martha Reynolds, even from Maxwell's household staff, who had observed the positive changes in both Lucas and Maxwell since Ember had entered their lives. Meredith Jackson conducted several more observations, including unannounced visits to both households. Her reports noted the striking difference in Ember's demeanor in each environment, subdued and anxious with the Sullivans, vibrant and confident with the Thorntons. But the Sullivans had advantages of their own. Their biological connection to Ember was significant in the eyes of the court. They had impeccable community standing, were financially secure, and could offer Ember a two-parent household with deep roots in their community. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Maxwell received an unexpected call from Eleanor Sullivan. "Mr. Thornton," she began without preamble, "this legal battle is taking a toll on everyone, especially Ember. I'm calling to suggest a compromise." Maxwell was instantly wary. What kind of compromise? "We're willing to agree to a more balanced schedule, equal time in both households, with transitions happening at logical breaks like school holidays. This would give Ember stability while maintaining her connection to both families." The offer was surprisingly reasonable, which immediately made Maxwell suspicious. "Why the sudden change of heart, Mrs. Sullivan?" There was a slight pause. "Contrary to what you might believe, Mr. Thornton, we do want what's best for our granddaughter. This constant conflict isn't good for her. I'd need to discuss this with my attorney," Maxwell replied cautiously. "Of course, but I suggest you consider it seriously. A protracted legal battle could become very unpleasant for everyone involved." The subtle threat in her tone was unmistakable. Maxwell ended the call and immediately contacted Patricia, who was equally skeptical of the Sullivans' motives. "This feels like a tactical move," she observed, "but I can't figure out what they're gaining by offering this compromise now, just days before the hearing." The answer came later that evening, in the form of an urgent call from Meredith Jackson. "Maxwell, I've just come from an unannounced visit to the Sullivan home," she said, her voice tense. "Ember wasn't there. According to Eleanor, she's been enrolled in a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland, effective immediately. They put her on a plane this morning." Maxwell felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. "They can't do that. The court order specifies that Ember must divide her time between the two households, but doesn't explicitly prohibit either party from enrolling her in a school of their choosing," Meredith finished grimly. "It's a legal loophole they've exploited. So they offered me a compromise knowing Ember wouldn't even be in the country?" Maxwell's voice shook with fury and disbelief. "It appears so. I'm filing an emergency motion with the court tonight, but these things take time." After hanging up, Maxwell stood frozen in his penthouse foyer, overwhelmed by helplessness and rage. The Sullivans had outmaneuvered him, sending Ember thousands of miles away just days before a hearing that might have granted him custody. Lucas, who had overheard the conversation from his bedroom doorway, wheeled himself into the foyer. "Dad, what's happening? Where's Ember?" Maxwell knelt beside his son's wheelchair, struggling to keep his voice steady. "The Sullivans have sent her to a boarding school in Switzerland. We're going to do everything we can to bring her back, but it might take some time." Lucas's face crumpled. "But she'll be all alone there. She won't know anyone, and she'll be so scared." "I know, buddy." Maxwell pulled his son into a tight hug, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Dad," Lucas whispered, against his shoulder, "remember what you told me after Mom went to heaven? That sometimes we have to be brave not just for ourselves, but for the people we love." Maxwell nodded, throat too tight to speak. "I think we need to be brave for Ember now," Lucas continued. "She would want us to be brave and figure out a way to help her." The simple wisdom of his son's words cut through Maxwell's panic and rage, focusing his thoughts. "You're right, and that's exactly what we're going to do." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. While Patricia worked through legal channels, filing emergency motions, and seeking judicial intervention, Maxwell leveraged every business connection he had in Europe. He chartered a private jet, contacted the American embassy in Switzerland, and hired a local attorney familiar with Swiss laws regarding international custody disputes. The night before his scheduled flight to Switzerland, Maxwell sat in his study reviewing documents when a call came through from an unfamiliar international number. "Mr. Thornton?" The voice was young, female, heavily accented. "My name is Sophie Laurent. I'm a teaching assistant at Collège du Léman, where Ember Sullivan has been enrolled." Maxwell sat up straighter. "Is she all right?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally." Sophie hesitated. "She is very unhappy, Mr. Thornton. She cries every night and refuses to participate in activities. But that is not why I am calling. She asked me to deliver a message to you." "What message?" "She Said to tell you that she is looking for your constellation every night, but she cannot find it from here. The stars look different, and she is lost without her map. Maxwell felt tears spring to his eyes at the coded message. So, like Ember, to find a way to communicate even from thousands of miles away. Please tell her. Maxwell's voice broke. Tell her that stars may look different from different places, but they're still the same stars, and that I'm coming to help her find her way back to our constellation. I will tell her, Mr. Thornton. And Sophie lowered her voice. I should not say this, but the circumstances of her arrival were very unusual. No preparation, no orientation, just a child deposited with barely any explanation. Many of us on staff are concerned. That information strengthened Maxwell's resolve. Thank you for calling, Ms. Laurent, and for looking out for Ember. The following day, as Maxwell was making final preparations for his trip, Patricia called with unexpected news. The Sullivans are withdrawing their custody petition, she announced, disbelief evident in her voice. They're granting you full guardianship of Ember, with no conditions or visitation requirements. Maxwell could hardly believe what he was hearing. Why? What changed? I don't have all the details yet, but it appears that Richard Sullivan has been implicated in some questionable financial dealings. The timing suggests they're trying to avoid public scrutiny that would come with a contentious custody battle. So they're just giving up after everything they've done. It appears so. They've already contacted the school in Switzerland, authorizing Ember's immediate release into your care. The court is expediting the guardianship paperwork as we speak. 3 days later, Maxwell stood in the arrivals area of JFK Airport, Lucas beside him in his wheelchair, both watching the doors anxiously. When Ember finally appeared, escorted by an airline representative, her face lit up with a joy that made every struggle, every sleepless night, every legal battle worth it. Lucas! Max! She cried, breaking free from her escort and running toward them, her red hair already growing out from the pixie cut flying behind her like a flame. She threw herself into Maxwell's arms first, then bent to hug Lucas, tears and laughter mingling as the three of them formed their own constellation right there in the middle of the busy airport terminal. You found me, Ember kept saying. You found me. We'll always find you, Maxwell promised, his voice rough with emotion. Always. Later that evening, as the three of them stood on the rooftop terrace gazing at the stars, Ember nestled between Maxwell and Lucas's wheelchair. A peaceful silence enveloped them. The legal paperwork was complete, the guardianship official. Ember Sullivan was now in every way that mattered, Ember Thornton. Look, Lucas said, pointing upward. It's Orion's belt, the 3 stars in a perfect line. Like us, Ember said softly. 3 stars